Karen Mitchell had always believed she was special. At 43 years old, she carried herself with an air of superiority that made heads turn, though not always for the right reasons. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, her designer sunglasses perched atop her head, and her Louis Vuitton handbag swung from her arm as she walked through the streets of London on a humid August afternoon. She had come to England with her husband, David, and their 2 teenage children for what she called a proper vacation. But from the moment they landed at Heathrow Airport, Karen had been complaining. The hotel room was too small. The tea was too weak. The people weren't friendly enough. David had learned long ago to simply nod and agree, finding it easier than arguing. On their 3rd day in London, the family planned to visit Buckingham Palace. Karen had seen it in movies and photographs countless times, but she wanted to get the perfect picture for her social media followers. She had been building her Instagram presence for years, and this trip was the ultimate opportunity to show everyone back home in Dallas, Texas, just how cultured and sophisticated she was. As they approached the palace gates, tourists crowded around, taking photographs and admiring the iconic building. The royal guards stood at attention in their traditional red uniforms and tall bearskin hats, perfectly still and silent. Karen's eyes lit up with opportunity. She had heard about these guards, how they weren't allowed to move or speak while on duty. She saw them as nothing more than living statues, props for her perfect photograph. The family stood behind the barrier with the other tourists, snapping photos from a respectful distance. But for Karen, this wasn't enough. She wanted something different, something that would make her friends back home jealous. She wanted a close-up, a photo that would go viral, something that would make her Instagram account explode with likes and comments. David noticed the look in his wife's eyes and immediately felt nervous. He had seen that expression before, usually right before she made a scene in a restaurant or berated a store clerk. Their daughter, Emma, was busy on her phone, while their son, Tyler, seemed more interested in a nearby souvenir shop than the palace itself. Karen stepped closer to the barrier, eyeing the guard who stood nearest to her. He was young, probably in his mid-20s, with a stern expression and eyes fixed straight ahead. His rifle was positioned precisely, his posture impeccable. Karen thought he looked ridiculous in his uniform, like a toy soldier come to life. She pulled out her phone and walked right up to the barrier, leaning over it to get a better angle. Other tourists glanced at her, some with disapproval, but Karen didn't care. She never cared what others thought. In her mind, rules were for other people, not for her. The guard remained motionless, his training evident in every fiber of his being. Karen took several photos, but none of them satisfied her. They all looked the same as everyone else's pictures. She needed something more, something unique. That's when the idea struck her. What if she could get the guard to react? What if she could capture the moment when one of these famously stoic soldiers broke their composure? The video would be priceless. She would be internet famous overnight. Karen pulled out her phone and switched it to video mode. She then did something that made David's heart sink. She ducked under the barrier, stepping into the restricted area. Several tourists gasped. A police officer nearby started moving toward her, but Karen was quick. She walked right up to the guard, standing just inches from him. She waved her hand in front of his face. Nothing. She made funny noises. Still nothing. The guard's eyes remained fixed ahead, though a slight tension appeared in his jaw. Karen laughed, emboldened by what she perceived as weakness. She had always believed that authority figures were just regular people pretending to be important. She had no respect for uniforms, for rules, or for tradition. In her world, she was the center of the universe, and everyone else existed to serve her or entertain her. David finally found his voice. "Karen, please come back here. You're going to get in trouble." But Karen ignored him. She always ignored him. She reached out and poked the guard's arm. Still no reaction. The crowd around them had grown larger, with people pulling out their phones to record this American tourist making a spectacle of herself. Some were amused, others horrified, but all were watching. The police officer was getting closer now, speaking into his radio. Karen didn't notice or didn't care. She was too focused on her mission to get a reaction from the guard. She tapped his rifle. She made faces at him. She even tried to peek under his tall hat. Then Karen remembered something she had purchased back in Dallas, something she kept in her purse for protection. It was a small pink taser, compact enough to fit in her palm. She had bought it after watching a late-night infomercial. convinced that London would be dangerous and she would need to defend herself. In her twisted logic, Karen thought this would be the perfect way to get a reaction. She would give the guard a little shock, just enough to make him jump or flinch. It would be harmless, she told herself. Just a little prank. The video would be hilarious. David saw her reaching into her purse and his stomach dropped. He knew that look, knew she was about to do something terrible. He started pushing through the crowd, desperately trying to reach her before she did something they would all regret. Karen pulled out the pink taser, holding it up with a triumphant smile. The crowd's murmur grew louder. Someone shouted a warning. The police officer broke into a run. But Karen, blinded by her own arrogance and her desperate need for attention and validation, didn't see any of it. She looked directly into her phone camera, which she had propped up on the barrier, and said with a laugh, "Watch this, y'all. This is going to be epic." Then she reached out and pressed the taser against the guard's arm, her finger hovering over the trigger button. In that moment, everything changed. The guard's eyes flickered just slightly. The police officer was shouting. David was screaming her name. And Karen, still smiling, still thinking this was all just harmless fun, had no idea that her entire life was about to come crashing down around her. The peaceful afternoon at Buckingham Palace was about to become an international incident, and Karen Mitchell was about to learn a lesson she would never forget. The moment Karen pressed the taser trigger, everything seemed to happen in slow motion and lightning speed at the same time. The electrical current crackled through the air, and the guard, despite his rigorous training, let out a sharp gasp. His body tensed, his rifle shifted slightly, and for just a second, the perfect stillness that defined the Royal Guards was broken. But Karen's triumphant smile lasted only a fraction of a second. What happened next was nothing like she had imagined. The guard, recovering almost instantly, took one precise step back into his position. At the same moment, three things occurred simultaneously. The police officer who had been running toward her grabbed Karen's arm with a grip like steel. Two more officers appeared from seemingly nowhere, surrounding her completely, and a loud alarm began blaring through the palace grounds. Karen dropped the taser in shock. The reality of what she had just done was starting to penetrate her bubble of entitlement, but she still didn't fully grasp the severity of the situation. She tried to pull her arm away from the officer, her voice rising to that particular pitch that had terrorized countless retail workers and restaurant managers back home. "Get your hands off me. Do you know who I am? I'm an American citizen. You can't treat me like this," she shrieked, her face turning red. The officer, a stern-faced woman named Sergeant Patricia Hayes, had dealt with difficult tourists before, but this was something else entirely. "Ma'am, you are under arrest for assault on a member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces, trespassing in a restricted area, and possession of a prohibited weapon," she said calmly but firmly. Karen's mouth fell open. Assault, prohibited weapon? This couldn't be happening. It was just a joke, just a harmless prank for social media. She looked around desperately for David, spotting him in the crowd with his face buried in his hands. Emma was crying, and Tyler looked like he wanted to disappear into the ground. "This is ridiculous. I barely touched him." "He's fine. Look at him, he's standing right there," Karen argued, trying to gesture toward the guard, but the officers had already begun handcuffing her wrists behind her back. The crowd that had been watching had grown even larger. Dozens of phones were pointed at her, recording every moment of her humiliation. The very fame she had sought was now hers, but not in the way she had imagined. Within minutes, the videos would be uploaded to social media, and Karen Mitchell's face would be known around the world. Sergeant Hayes began reciting Karen's rights in the formal British manner, but Karen wasn't listening. She was too busy shouting about her rights as an American, demanding to speak to the ambassador, threatening lawsuits, and insisting this was all a terrible misunderstanding. "I want my lawyer. I want to call the American embassy. You people are going to regret this. Do you have any idea how many followers I have?" Karen's voice echoed across the palace grounds. David finally managed to push through the crowd, his face pale and sweaty. "Officers, please, my wife didn't mean any harm. She doesn't always think things through. Can we just apologize and leave?" Sergeant Hayes turned to him with a look that could freeze fire. "Sir, your wife assaulted a royal guard with a weapon. This is not something that can be resolved with an apology. She will be taken into custody, processed, and will appear before a magistrate." David felt his legs go weak. A magistrate. This meant court. This meant serious legal trouble. This meant their vacation was over, and their lives were about to become a nightmare. He thought about their business back home, their reputation in their community, their children's futures. All of it was crashing down because Karen couldn't control herself for one afternoon. The officers led Karen toward a waiting police van, and she continued to resist every step of the way. She tried to dig her heels into the ground. She twisted and turned. She kept shouting about her rights and how unfair this all was. Other tourists watched in stunned silence, some shaking their heads, others whispering to each other in various languages. As they approached the van, a news crew that had been filming a segment about tourism at the palace caught sight of the commotion. The reporter, sensing a story, rushed over with her cameraman. This was going to be more than just social media viral. This was going to be on the evening news. Inside the police van, Karen finally fell silent, but only because reality was beginning to sink in. She was in handcuffs. She was in a police vehicle. This was actually happening. But even then, her first thought wasn't about what she had done wrong. It was about how unfair it all was, how she was the victim here, how everyone was overreacting. The drive to the police station took only 15 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. Karen looked out the window at the London streets, seeing the city differently now. It wasn't a backdrop for her perfect vacation photos anymore. It was a place where she was a criminal, where she had broken the law, where she was about to face consequences that her privilege and loud voice couldn't shield her from. At the police station, the processing began. Karen was photographed, fingerprinted, and placed in a holding cell. The cell was small, cold, and smelled of disinfectant and despair. She sat on the hard bench, her designer clothes looking out of place against the gray concrete walls. And for the first time in years, Karen Mitchell was completely alone with her thoughts. Meanwhile, back at Buckingham Palace, David was dealing with his own nightmare. He had to speak with security officials, provide statements, and try to figure out how to help his wife while also comforting his traumatized children. Emma couldn't stop crying, embarrassed beyond words that her mother's behavior had been witnessed by hundreds of people. Tyler remained silent, his jaw clenched, angry at his mother for ruining their trip and humiliating their family. An official from the American embassy arrived within a few hours, a tired-looking man named Robert Chen, who had dealt with American tourists in trouble before. But even he seemed taken aback by the severity of Karen's actions. "Mr. Mitchell," he said gravely, "I have to be honest with you. Your wife is in serious trouble. Assaulting a royal guard is not taken lightly here. Tasers are illegal in the UK. She trespassed in a restricted area at one of the most high-profile locations in the country. This isn't going to just go away." David nodded numbly, his hands shaking as he signed various forms and documents. He kept replaying the moment in his mind, wishing he had stopped her sooner, wishing he had been more forceful in his objections, wishing he had left her at the hotel that morning. Back in her cell, Karen's phone had been confiscated so she couldn't see what was happening online. But if she could have, she would have been horrified. The videos of her tasering the guard were everywhere. They had been shared millions of times. News outlets around the world were picking up the story. Headlines screamed about the ugly American tourist and the taser Karen at Buckingham Palace. Her face was on television screens in dozens of countries. Social media was merciless. People were digging into her background, finding her social media accounts, sharing screenshots of her previous entitled behavior. Old posts where she had bragged about making waitresses cry or getting managers fired were being circulated. Her Instagram, which she had hoped would gain followers from this trip, was indeed gaining attention, but every new comment was criticism, mockery, or outrage. Karen sat in that cell for 6 hours before she was finally allowed to see a solicitor, a sharp-eyed British lawyer named Margaret Thornton, who specialized in representing tourists in legal trouble. Margaret Thornton walked into the consultation room with a leather briefcase and an expression that suggested she had already heard everything about Karen's case. She was in her 50s with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun, and glasses that she peered over when she wanted to make a point. She had been practicing law for 27 years and had seen every type of defendant imaginable. Karen looked up as the door opened, her makeup smudged from crying, her carefully styled hair now a mess. For a moment she felt a surge of hope. Finally, someone who would listen to her side of the story. Someone who would understand that this was all blown out of proportion. Mrs. Mitchell, I'm Margaret Thornton. I've been assigned to represent you, the lawyer said, sitting down across from Karen and opening her briefcase. She pulled out a thick folder and placed it on the table between them. Oh, thank God, Karen said, leaning forward. You have to get me out of here. This is all a huge mistake. I didn't do anything wrong. That guard is perfectly fine. I barely touched him. These people are acting like I committed murder or something. Margaret looked at Karen over her glasses, her expression neutral. Mrs. Mitchell, before we proceed, I need you to understand something very clearly. You are facing very serious charges. This is not a mistake, and this is not going to simply go away. Karen's face flushed, but it was just a joke, a prank. I see people on YouTube do stuff like this all the time. Mrs. Mitchell, Margaret interrupted, her voice firm but not unkind. You assaulted a member of the British Armed Forces while they were on duty at one of the most important royal residences in the United Kingdom. You used a weapon that is illegal to possess in this country. You trespassed in a clearly marked restricted area. These are not pranks. These are crimes. The word crimes hit Karen like a punch to the stomach. Crimes. She wasn't a criminal. She was a respectable businesswoman from Texas. She volunteered at her church sometimes. She donated to charity. Well, she had donated $20 once to a Facebook fundraiser. That counted, didn't it? What? What's going to happen to me? Karen asked, her voice suddenly small. Margaret opened the folder and began reviewing the documents inside. You'll appear before a magistrate tomorrow morning for your first hearing. At that hearing, they'll formally read the charges against you and determine whether you'll be released on bail or remanded in custody pending trial. Trial? Karen's voice cracked. There's going to be a trial? Most likely, yes. Unless you plead guilty, which we can discuss. But Mrs. Mitchell, I need you to understand the potential consequences here. Assault on a royal guard can carry a prison sentence of up to 6 months. Possession of a prohibited weapon can add another 6 months to that. Trespassing in a restricted area at a royal residence carries its own penalties. Karen felt the room spinning. Prison. Prison sentence. This couldn't be real. This had to be a nightmare. She would wake up in her hotel room and this would all be over. But I'm American, Karen said weakly, as if her nationality was some kind of magic shield against consequences. Yes, and that actually makes things more complicated, not easier, Margaret replied. This incident has received significant media attention. It's become an international story. The Crown Prosecution Service is under pressure to make an example of this case to deter other tourists from similar behavior. Karen's hands were shaking now. She clasped them together on the table, trying to maintain some composure. I want to go home. Can't I just go home? Can't we pay a fine or something? Margaret shook her head. Your passport has been seized. You're not leaving the country until this is resolved. And no, a simple fine is unlikely given the nature of the offenses. For the first time in her life, Karen's usual strategy of demanding, complaining, and threatening wasn't working. She couldn't Karen her way out of this situation. The manager wasn't going to come out and apologize. No discount was going to make this better. She was in a foreign country in a jail cell, facing actual criminal charges. Tell me exactly what happened, Margaret said, pulling out a notepad. From the beginning. And Mrs. Mitchell, I need you to be completely honest with me. Don't minimize what you did. Don't make excuses. Just tell me the facts. Karen took a shaky breath and began to recount the story. But even as she told it, she found herself trying to justify her actions, trying to explain that she didn't mean any harm, that it was supposed to be funny. Margaret listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes, her expression never changing. When Karen finished, Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that would stick with Karen for the rest of her life. Mrs. Mitchell, do you know what entitlement is? Karen blinked, confused by the question. What? Entitlement? It's when someone believes that the rules don't apply to them, that they're special, that their wants and desires are more important than other people's safety, dignity, or rights. From everything you've told me, and from what I've seen in the police reports, you suffer from an extreme case of entitlement. Karen wanted to argue, wanted to defend herself, but something in Margaret's calm, matter-of-fact tone stopped her. You saw barriers and warnings, and you ignored them because you wanted a better photograph, Margaret continued. You saw a soldier performing his duty, and you saw him not as a person but as a prop for your entertainment. You brought an illegal weapon into a foreign country, and when none of your antics got the reaction you wanted, You escalated to physical assault. At every point you had a choice to stop, and at every point you chose to continue. Tears began rolling down Karen's cheeks. Not tears of self-pity this time, but something else. Something that felt uncomfortably like shame. "I didn't think," Karen whispered. "No, you didn't," Margaret agreed. "But that's not a defense. Adults are expected to think about the consequences of their actions. The law doesn't care that you didn't think it through." Karen wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "What should I do? Right now? You should think very carefully about your behavior. Not just today, but in your life in general. Tomorrow at the hearing, you'll plead not guilty for now, which gives us time to negotiate with the prosecution. But Mrs. Mitchell, you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that you may serve time in a British prison." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Karen had never even had a speeding ticket before. The thought of being in prison away from her home, her comfortable life, her family was terrifying beyond words. "Is there anything I can do?" Karen asked desperately. "Anything at all that might help?" Margaret considered this. "The prosecution will be looking at your character, your remorse, your likelihood to reoffend. If you can demonstrate genuine understanding of why what you did was wrong, genuine remorse and a commitment to making amends, it might influence their decision. But it has to be genuine, Mrs. Mitchell. Judges and prosecutors can spot fake remorse from a mile away." After Margaret left, Karen was returned to her cell. She lay on the hard bench staring at the ceiling, and for the first time in decades she really looked at herself. She thought about all the times she had berated service workers, the times she had demanded to speak to managers, the times she had made scenes in public, the times she had treated people as if they existed only to serve her. The morning of the court hearing arrived too quickly. Karen had barely slept, the events of the previous day playing on an endless loop in her mind. She was given a chance to clean herself up, but looking in the mirror was painful. The woman staring back at her looked old, tired, and defeated. This wasn't the confident, put-together Karen Mitchell who had boarded the plane to London just days ago. David was allowed to visit her briefly before the hearing. He looked like he hadn't slept either. His eyes were red, his suit wrinkled, and when he saw Karen, he didn't rush to embrace her. Instead, he stood at a distance, his hands in his pockets, looking at her with an expression she had never seen before. It was disappointment mixed with something else. Resignation, perhaps. "The kids are with a victim support officer at the hotel," he said quietly. "Emma hasn't stopped crying. Tyler won't talk to anyone." Karen felt a stab of pain in her chest. Her children. She had been so focused on her own situation that she hadn't fully considered what this was doing to them. They were teenagers at that vulnerable age where embarrassment felt like death, and now their mother was an international laughingstock facing criminal charges in a foreign country. "David, I'm so sorry," Karen said, her voice breaking. "Are you?" David asked, and there was an edge to his voice that she had never heard before. "Are you really sorry, Karen? Or are you just sorry you got caught?" The question hit her like a slap. Karen opened her mouth to respond, to defend herself, but the words died in her throat. Was she sorry? Really, truly sorry? Or was she just sorry about the consequences? Before she could answer, a guard arrived to take her to the courtroom. David followed at a distance, and Karen could feel the space between them growing with each step. The courtroom was nothing like the ones Karen had seen on American television. It was formal, old-fashioned, with dark wood paneling and an atmosphere of serious authority. The magistrate, a woman named Judge Sarah Pemberton, sat elevated behind the bench, her expression stern and unreadable. The public gallery was packed. Reporters had notebooks ready. Sketch artists were already drawing. And in the back, Karen could see several people wearing Royal Guard uniforms there to observe the proceedings. The young guard she had tasered was among them, his face impassive as he looked straight ahead. Karen's legs felt weak as she stood in the dock. The charges were read out in formal legal language that made them sound even more serious than she had imagined. Assault on a member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces, possession of a prohibited weapon, trespassing in a restricted area. Each charge was followed by the potential penalties, and Karen felt sicker with each word. "How do you plead?" Judge Pemberton asked. Margaret had instructed Karen to plead not guilty for now, to give them time to negotiate. But as Karen stood there looking at the judge, at the guard she had assaulted, at David sitting in the gallery with his head bowed, something inside her shifted. "Mrs. Mitchell," the judge prompted. "How do you plead?" Karen took a deep breath. Margaret was giving her a sharp look, shaking her head slightly, but Karen ignored her. "Guilty, Your Honor," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I plead guilty to all charges." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Margaret's eyes widened in shock. This was not the plan. Pleading guilty at the first hearing meant there would be no negotiation, no plea bargain, no chance to reduce the charges. It meant Karen was throwing herself at the mercy of the court. Judge Pemberton looked surprised as well, but she maintained her composure. "Mrs. Mitchell, do you understand what you're saying? You're pleading guilty to very serious charges. Have you discussed this with your solicitor?" "No, Your Honor," Karen said, and now her voice was stronger. "But I am guilty. I did everything they said I did. I assaulted that young man over there. I brought an illegal weapon into your country. I trespassed where I shouldn't have been. I did all of it and I'm guilty." The judge studied Karen for a long moment. "Very well. Given the unusual circumstances of this early guilty plea, I'm going to allow victim impact statements before sentencing. Bailiff, please bring forward guard James Patterson." The young guard Karen had tasered stood and walked to the witness box. Up close, Karen could see he was even younger than she had thought, probably no more than 22 or 23. He had a kind face despite his formal military bearing. "Guard Patterson," Judge Pemberton said, "you were the victim of Mrs. Mitchell's assault. Would you like to make a statement?" James Patterson cleared his throat. When he spoke, his voice was clear and measured. "Yes, Your Honor. I've served in the Royal Guard for 3 years. It's an honor I take very seriously. We're trained to remain still and focused regardless of what happens around us. We're there to protect the palace and the royal family, and we represent the dignity and tradition of the British Armed Forces." He paused, and for the first time he looked directly at Karen. "When Mrs. Mitchell approached me, I thought it was just another tourist who didn't understand the boundaries. We get that sometimes, but when she used that taser on me, it wasn't just painful, it was humiliating. She treated me like I wasn't a real person, like I was just a toy for her entertainment." Karen felt tears streaming down her face as she listened. "I'm not permanently injured," James continued. "Physically, I'm fine. But what bothers me is what this says about how some people view us. We're not props. We're soldiers. We're people with families and lives and dignity. We deserve respect, just like anyone else." When James finished and returned to his seat, the courtroom was silent. Then Judge Pemberton turned to Karen. "Mrs. Mitchell, you've pleaded guilty. Before I consider sentencing, is there anything you'd like to say?" Karen stood, her hands gripping the edge of the dock to keep them from shaking. Margaret was looking at her with concern, probably worried about what Karen might say. But Karen knew she had to speak, had to say the things that had been building inside her since that terrible moment at the palace. "Your Honor, I don't know how to explain what I did except to say that I've spent most of my life thinking I was more important than other people." Karen began, her voice thick with emotion. "I've treated service workers terribly. I've made scenes in restaurants. I've bullied people who couldn't fight back. I've taught my children by example that it's okay to act like the rules don't apply to us." She looked at James Patterson, meeting his eyes for the first time. "I'm so deeply sorry for what I did to you. You're right. I didn't see you as a person. I saw you as something I could use to get attention online. That's shameful. That's wrong. And I'm sorry." Karen turned back to the judge. "I deserve whatever punishment you decide to give me. I'm not asking for mercy or special treatment. I just want you to know that I understand now. I understand what entitlement is, and I understand that I've been entitled my whole life, and I want to change that. I need to change that." Judge Pemberton listened to Karen's statement with careful attention. When Karen finished speaking and sat down, the courtroom remained silent, everyone waiting to hear what the judge would say. The weight of the moment was palpable, and Karen felt as though time itself had slowed to a crawl. "Mrs. Mitchell," Judge Pemberton began, removing her glasses and setting them on the bench in front of her. "This is one of the most unusual cases I've seen in my 15 years on the bench. Not because of the nature of the crimes, which are serious but not unprecedented, but because of the rapid transformation I appear to be witnessing in the defendant." Karen held her breath, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. "Your guilty plea, entered against your solicitor's advice, shows at least some level of accountability," the judge continued. "Your statement shows what appears to be genuine remorse and self-awareness. However, actions have consequences, and the law must be upheld regardless of whether someone feels sorry afterward. Judge Pemberton picked up a document from her desk and reviewed it briefly. I've considered the victim impact statement from Guard Patterson, which was both eloquent and restrained. I've considered the circumstances of your offense, which took place at one of Britain's most significant national landmarks. I've considered your lack of prior criminal record, and I've considered your apparent remorse. Karen felt David's eyes on her from the gallery. She didn't dare turn around to look at him. For the charge of assault on a member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces, Judge Pemberton said, I sentence you to 4 months in prison suspended for 2 years. Karen's lawyer leaned over and whispered, that means you won't go to prison unless you commit another offense in the next 2 years. For possession of a prohibited weapon, the judge continued, I sentence you to 3 months in prison, suspended for 2 years, to run concurrent with the first sentence. Karen felt a tiny spark of relief. No prison. She wouldn't have to go to prison. But Judge Pemberton wasn't finished. However, Mrs. Mitchell, a suspended sentence alone does not adequately address the severity of what you've done or send an appropriate message to others who might consider similar actions. Therefore, I'm also ordering the following. You will perform 300 hours of community service to be completed in the United Kingdom. You will pay a fine of £10,000 to be donated to military charities supporting serving members and veterans of the British Armed Forces. You will issue a formal public apology that will be distributed to media outlets, and you are banned from entering the grounds of any royal residence in the United Kingdom for the remainder of your life. The relief Karen had felt moments ago evaporated. 300 hours of community service. In the UK, that meant she couldn't just go home and forget about this. £10,000 was roughly $12,000. The fine would hurt financially, and a public apology meant the whole world would see her humiliation. Furthermore, Judge Pemberton added, I'm requiring you to attend and complete a course on cultural sensitivity and respect for authority. Your passport will remain seized until you've completed at least half of your community service hours and paid the fine in full. Do you understand these conditions, Mrs. Mitchell? Karen stood shakily. Yes, Your Honor, I understand. Then court is adjourned. As the judge left the courtroom, Karen collapsed back into her seat. Margaret gathered her papers, her expression thoughtful. You're incredibly lucky, Mrs. Mitchell. That could have been much worse. But you need to understand that the next 2 years of your life are going to be very different from what you're used to. David was waiting outside the courtroom. When Karen emerged, escorted by Margaret and a court officer, she saw him standing against the wall, his arms crossed. Their eyes met, and Karen saw something in his face that frightened her more than the judge's sentence. He looked tired, worn down, and distant. We need to find a place to stay, David said quietly. Long term. The hotel is too expensive if we're going to be here for months. Months. The word hung between them like a stone. Their vacation had turned into an extended nightmare, and it was all Karen's fault. Over the next week, reality set in with brutal efficiency. David found a small, modest flat in a less expensive part of London. It was nothing like their spacious home in Dallas. It was cramped, old, and the heating barely worked. Emma and Tyler, who had been enrolled in online school to keep up with their education, moved through the flat like ghosts, barely speaking to their mother. The videos of Karen's arrest had gone viral globally. Her face was everywhere, used as an example of entitled tourist behavior, of Karens gone too far, of American arrogance abroad. The comments were brutal, numbering in the millions. Her Instagram account, which she had hoped would gain followers, had indeed exploded. But every comment was negative. People from Dallas who knew her were sharing stories about her past behavior. Restaurants she had been banned from, stores where she had caused scenes. Karen's community service assignment was at a homeless shelter in East London. On her first day, she arrived in her designer clothes and expensive jewelry, completely out of place among the volunteers in simple jeans and t-shirts. The shelter director, a no-nonsense woman named Patricia who had spent 30 years working with the homeless, took one look at Karen and shook her head. You can't wear those clothes here, Patricia said bluntly. You'll need to change. We have spare t-shirts and jeans in the back. Karen started to protest, started to explain that these were expensive clothes, but she caught herself. That was the old Karen talking, the entitled Karen. She closed her mouth and nodded. Of course. I'll change. The work at the shelter was hard. Karen had never done manual labor in her life. She served food to people who were hungry and homeless. many of whom had mental health issues or addiction problems. She cleaned bathrooms that made her gag. She sorted through donations of old clothes. She mopped floors and washed dishes and took out garbage. On her third day, an elderly homeless man named Tom asked her why she was there. Karen had seen him around the shelter, always polite, always saying thank you, despite having nothing. She sat down next to him during a break, her body aching from the unfamiliar physical work. "I did something really stupid," Karen admitted. "I hurt someone because I thought I was more important than they were. Now I'm here trying to make up for it." Tom nodded slowly, his weathered face thoughtful. "Everyone makes mistakes," he said. "The question is what you learn from them." Those words stayed with Karen. Every day at the shelter she met people who had so little but were so grateful for any help. She met volunteers who gave their time freely, expecting nothing in return. She met staff members who worked long hours for low pay because they believed in helping others. Meanwhile, David had to find work to support them during their extended stay. Their business back home was being managed by their employees, but not having the owners present was taking a toll. David found a temporary job consulting for a London firm, but the salary was less than half what he made in Dallas, and the stress was enormous. Emma and Tyler were suffering too. They had left their friends, their school, their normal lives behind. Emma, who had been popular and confident, was now withdrawn and anxious, constantly worried that her friends back home had seen the videos of her mother. Tyler, angry and resentful, blamed Karen for ruining their lives. 3 months into her community service, Karen stood in the shelter's kitchen washing dishes, her hands red and pruned from the hot water. She had just finished serving lunch to 75 people, and her feet ached from standing for hours. The Karen Mitchell who had stepped off that plane in London would have considered this work beneath her. But this Karen, the one who woke up each morning in a cramped flat and took the bus to the shelter, was beginning to understand something she had never grasped before. Everyone matters. Everyone deserves dignity and respect. Patricia, the shelter director, had been watching Karen's transformation with cautious interest. She had seen court-ordered volunteers before, people who counted down the hours until they could leave and never come back. But Karen was different. She stayed late. She asked questions. She learned the names of the shelter's regular visitors and remembered their stories. One afternoon, Patricia called Karen into her office. Karen's heart sank, worried she had done something wrong. But when she entered, Patricia was smiling, something Karen had rarely seen. "Sit down, Karen," Patricia said, gesturing to a chair. "I wanted to talk to you about your progress here." Karen sat nervously, her hands folded in her lap. "When you first arrived, I'll be honest, I didn't think you'd last a week," Patricia said. "I thought you'd be like so many others who do their time and leave without learning anything. But you've surprised me. You've genuinely engaged with the people here. You've shown compassion and humility. I wanted you to know that I see that and I appreciate it." Tears filled Karen's eyes. It had been so long since anyone had said anything kind to her. "Thank you," she whispered. "This place has taught me more than any other experience in my life." "I'm glad to hear that," Patricia said, "because I'd like to offer you something. After you complete your required hours, I'd like you to consider volunteering here regularly. Not because you have to, but because you want to. We can always use dedicated people." Karen was stunned. She had never imagined that anyone would want her to continue after her sentence was served. "I would be honored," she said. At home, things were slowly improving with her family, though the damage Karen had caused would take years to fully heal. David had started talking to her again, though their conversations were different now. They were more honest, more real. One evening, as they sat together in their small flat, David said something that Karen had been dreading. "When we get back to Dallas, things are going to be different," he said quietly. "People know what happened. Your face was everywhere. Our business has suffered. We've lost clients who don't want to be associated with us anymore." Karen nodded, her throat tight. "I know. I'm so sorry, David. I'm sorry for everything I've put you and the kids through." David looked at her, really looked at her for the first time in months. "Are you different, Karen? Really different? Or is this just an act until we can go home?" It was the same question he had asked in the jail, and this time Karen had an answer. "I'm different," she said. "I can't promise I'll be perfect. I know I'll make mistakes. But I see things differently now. I see people differently. I see myself differently. Emma had been listening from her room and she emerged, standing in the doorway. At 16, she looked older than when they had arrived in London, the ordeal aging her in ways that broke Karen's heart. "Mom," Emma said softly, "I need you to know how hard this has been. I've been bullied online. People I thought were my friends shared those videos and laughed at you, at us. I've had to change my social media accounts, use different names. It's been awful." Karen stood and walked to her daughter, tears streaming down her face. "I know, baby. I know, and I'm so sorry. I wish I could take it back. I wish I could protect you from all of this. But maybe," Emma continued, her own eyes wet with tears, "maybe some good can come from it. I've learned what not to do. I've learned how not to treat people. And I've seen you change, Mom. I've seen you work hard and be humble. That's something." Tyler remained distant, his anger a wall that Karen didn't know how to climb. But she kept trying, kept showing up, kept proving through her actions that she was different now. The day finally came when Karen completed her 300 hours of community service. Patricia held a small ceremony at the shelter, and many of the regular visitors came to say goodbye. Tom, the elderly homeless man who had been so kind to her, shook her hand. "You came here broken," he said, "and you're leaving whole. That's a gift." Karen had also completed the cultural sensitivity course, where she had learned about the history and significance of the British Royal Guard, about respect for different cultures, and about the impact of entitled behavior on society. The instructor, a former diplomat, had told her something that resonated deeply. Respect isn't about authority or status. It's about recognizing the inherent worth of every human being. The public apology that Judge Pemberton had required was released to the media. Karen had written it herself, refusing Margaret's offers to help craft something more legally protective. It was raw, honest, and heartfelt. She apologized to James Patterson specifically, to the Royal Guards generally, to the people of Britain for disrespecting their traditions, and to her family for the pain she had caused them. The apology went viral, though this time the responses were more mixed. Many people remained angry and unforgiving, but some recognized the genuine remorse in her words. Before they could return to the United States, Karen asked Margaret to arrange a meeting. It took weeks to organize, but finally it was granted. Karen sat in a small room in a government building, and guard James Patterson walked in, now in civilian clothes. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," Karen said, her voice shaking. "I know you didn't have to." James sat down across from her, his expression guarded. "I was curious," he admitted. "I wanted to see if you had really changed or if it was all for show." "I have changed," Karen said. "Not completely, maybe not enough, but I have. And I wanted to tell you again in person how sorry I am. You were right when you said I didn't see you as a person. I've spent the last few months learning to see people, really see them. And I'm grateful for that lesson, even though I hate how I learned it." James studied her for a moment. "I've followed your story," he said. "I saw your apology. I heard about your community service. My mates in the Guard, they all thought I should refuse to meet you, but I figured everyone deserves a second chance." "I don't deserve it," Karen said, "but I'm grateful for it." They talked for an hour, a real conversation between two people. James told her about his family, his dreams of becoming an officer, his pride in serving. Karen told him about her transformation, about the shelter, about her family. When they parted, James shook her hand. "I forgive you," he said simply. "I hope you continue to grow from this." Those words gave Karen something she didn't know she needed. Permission to forgive herself, even just a little. 6 months after that terrible day at Buckingham Palace, the Mitchell family boarded a plane back to Dallas. Karen looked out the window as London disappeared below them, feeling both relief and sadness. Relief to be going home, but sadness to leave the place where she had been forced to face herself. The return to Dallas was difficult. Their business had indeed suffered, losing nearly 40% of their clients. Their social circle had contracted, with many former friends distancing themselves from the scandal. Karen's social media accounts remained active, but she rarely posted, and when she did, it was different. She shared resources about homelessness, about respecting service workers, about combating entitlement. She found a homeless shelter in Dallas similar to the one in London and began volunteering there weekly. David watched his wife, still cautious, still uncertain, but beginning to believe that the change might be real. Emma slowly rebuilt her life. finding new friends who hadn't known about the incident. Tyler's anger began to fade, replaced by a cautious hope that his mother might actually be different. 1 year after the incident, Karen stood in line at a coffee shop. The barista, a young woman probably no older than Emma, got her order wrong, bringing her a latte instead of an Americano. The old Karen would have exploded, would have demanded to speak to the manager, would have made a scene. But this Karen simply smiled and said, "No problem, I'll drink it anyway. Thank you for working so hard today." The barista looked shocked, then relieved, then grateful. "Really, thank you for understanding. It's been a crazy morning." As Karen left the shop, she thought about that moment. It was such a small thing, being kind to someone who made a mistake, but it was also everything. It was proof that she had changed, that the lesson she had learned in London was real and lasting. That evening, Karen sat with her family for dinner. They were still healing, still rebuilding, but they were together. Tyler actually made a joke, and Emma laughed, and David smiled at Karen in a way he hadn't in over a year. It wasn't perfect. Their life wasn't what it had been before, but in many ways it was better. It was more real, more humble, more human. Karen thought about the taser in her purse that day at Buckingham Palace, how pressing that button had set off a chain reaction that destroyed her old life and forced her to build a new one. She thought about guard James Patterson, about Patricia at the shelter, about Tom the homeless man, about Judge Pemberton. Each of them had taught her,